The Great Chicken Fiasco. The sun had barely peeked over the rolling hills of Willow Creek when Sam Carter's peaceful morning was shattered. He sat on the weathered porch of his farmhouse, cradling a steaming mug of coffee, the kind of black brew that could wake a man from a coma. The air smelled of dew and hay, and the faint clucking of his hens drifted from the chicken coop 50 yards away. It was the kind of morning Sam lived for, quiet, predictable, and entirely his own. That is, until the squawking started. At first, he dismissed it as the usual ruckus from his flock. Chickens, after all, weren't known for their subtlety. But then came a sound that made his hand freeze mid-sip, a shrill, human scream that cut through the stillness like a knife. "Oh my heavens, what have they done to you?" Sam nearly dropped his mug. He turned his head toward the coop, squinting against the early light, and there she was, Lydia Grayson, the newcomer who'd rolled into town 4 weeks ago with a shiny SUV and an attitude to match. She stood by the coop, one hand clutching her chest as if she'd stumbled onto a crime scene, the other flailing wildly at the hens inside. Her blonde hair, usually styled to perfection, bobbed with every dramatic gesture. Sam sighed, setting his coffee on the porch railing. He'd dealt with nosy neighbors before, folks who thought they knew farming because they'd seen a documentary once. But Lydia was a category all her own. She'd already cornered him at the general store to lecture him about sustainable irrigation and asked why he didn't grow quinoa instead of corn. Now, it seemed, she'd set her sights on his chickens. He trudged across the yard, his boots crunching on the gravel path, already bracing himself for whatever nonsense she'd cooked up this time. As he approached, Lydia whirled around, her green eyes wide with theatrical outrage. "These poor birds," she gasped, clutching her designer jacket. "They're suffering. Look at them, pacing back and forth like they're in some kind of gulag. This is animal cruelty, Sam." Sam rubbed his temple, feeling a headache blooming already. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice steady, "those chickens are fine. They've got food, water, and a warm coop to sleep in. They ain't pacing. They're just pecking around, doing what chickens do." Lydia folded her arms, tilting her chin up like she was about to deliver a TED Talk. "Chickens deserve to be free," she declared. "They should be running around, exploring nature, not locked up in this chicken prison." Sam exhaled sharply through his nose. "Ma'am, do you know what happens to free-roaming chickens around here? Coyotes, foxes, hawks, if they ain't locked up at night, they don't see the sunrise." Lydia scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "That's absurd. Nature is kind. Animals belong in their natural environment, not behind bars like criminals." Sam bit the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing, or yelling. Nature kind? She clearly hadn't seen the fox that took 3 of his hens last spring, or the hawk that swooped down like a feathered missile. Instead of arguing, he tipped his worn baseball cap back and forced a tight smile. "I've been raising chickens longer than you've been complaining about, ma'am. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do." With that, he turned on his heel and headed back to the house, feeling her glare boring into his back. He knew this wasn't the end of it. Lydia wasn't the type to let anything go, not an argument, not a cause, and certainly not a chance to prove she was right. Later that afternoon, Sam hopped into his beat-up pickup truck and drove into town for supplies. He needed feed, a new rake, and maybe a cold soda from the diner if he felt like treating himself. The farm was quiet as he left, the chickens clucking contentedly in their coop, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. Lydia, meanwhile, saw her chance. She'd been stewing all morning, replaying Sam's words in her head, and growing more convinced that he was wrong, criminally wrong. Armed with a mix of self-righteous fury and a pair of gardening gloves she'd bought online, she marched back to Sam's property. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, then crept into his backyard like a spy on a mission. "This is for you, my little feathered friends," she whispered, her voice dripping with melodrama as she unlatched the coop door. For a moment, nothing happened. The chickens blinked at her, their tiny heads tilting in confusion. Lydia frowned. She'd pictured this moment like a movie scene, birds bursting forth in a triumphant explosion of feathers, grateful for their savior. "Go on, be free," she urged, waving her hands like she was directing traffic. Still, the hens hesitated, clucking uncertainly. Then, As if fate wanted to spice things up, a gust of wind slammed the coop door against the fence with a deafening bang. That did it. The chickens erupted into chaos. Feathers flew as they squawked and bolted from the coop, scattering in every direction. Lydia yelped as one hen flapped straight into her face, its wings smacking her cheeks. She stumbled backward, arms windmilling, while another darted between her legs, sending her crashing onto her back in the dirt. "Oh no," she breathed, watching the pandemonium unfold. One hen sprinted toward the neighbor's flower garden, trampling Mrs. Henderson's prize roses. Another bolted through the open gate and vanished into the street. A massive rooster, Sam called him Brutus, flapped onto the hood of Lydia's SUV, pecking furiously at his own reflection in the windshield. Lydia scrambled to her feet, trying to chase them down, but the chickens were faster and smarter than she'd expected. She lunged for one, only to grasp empty air as it zigzagged away. The more she tried to herd them, the wilder they became, darting across the yard like feathered tornadoes. The chaos spread like wildfire. A group of hens dashed into the Hendersons' backyard and plunged into their swimming pool, clucking and flapping as they bobbed in the water. Another sprinted into the general store, sending shoppers screaming as it skittered across the tile floor, knocking over a display of canned goods. And then came the piece de resistance. One adventurous hen, Sam's favorite, Daisy, darted into Willow Creek Park, where a wedding was in full swing. The bride, resplendent in a flowing white gown, let out a blood-curdling scream as Daisy launched herself into the three-tiered wedding cake, sending frosting and fondant flying. Guests scattered, the groom swore, and the photographer snapped what would later become the town's most infamous photo. By the time Sam returned, his truck rattling down the dirt road, Willow Creek had descended into poultry-fueled madness. Feathers littered the streets, people shouted, and three hens perched atop a police cruiser, pecking at the flashing lights like it was a game. Sam's jaw tightened as he took in the scene. He didn't need a detective to figure out who was behind this. His phone buzzed. He yanked it from his pocket and saw a notification, a video posted to social media by none other than Lydia Grayson. The caption read, "Chicken Liberation Day #FeatherFreedom." The footage showed her unlatching the coop, arms spread wide like some kind of barnyard prophet. "These poor, imprisoned birds are free at last," she proclaimed, her voice brimming with triumph. Sam groaned, rubbing his face. "Oh, for crying out loud." Before he could say more, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up beside him. Deputy Tom Reynolds stepped out, his broad frame dwarfing the car. He surveyed the chaos, the escaped chickens, the panicked townsfolk, the feathery carnage, and let out a long, weary sigh. "Sam," he said, crossing his arms, "what in the world happened here?" Sam tipped his cap back and jerked a thumb toward Lydia, who was currently trying to coax Brutus off her SUV. "Ask her," he said flatly. Tom followed Sam's gaze. Lydia squealed as Brutus flapped into her hair, clinging to her head like a feathered crown. She spun in circles, waving her arms, while the rooster crowed victoriously. Tom sighed again, shaking his head. "This is going to be a long day." Sam stood in the middle of Main Street, hands on his hips, watching his once orderly farm life unravel. Chickens were everywhere, clucking, flapping, invading places they had no business being. Daisy, his prized hen, had climbed onto Mayor Thompson's sedan and was pecking at the antenna like she was sending an SOS to the cosmos. Sam had faced droughts, storms, even a rogue raccoon that stole eggs for a month straight, but nothing compared to the disaster Lydia had unleashed. Deputy Tom adjusted his belt, his boots crunching on scattered feathers as he took in the scene. Through the diner's wide windows, Sam could see waitresses swinging trays at a trio of hens that had barged inside. Old Man Jenkins sat at the counter, sipping his coffee as if a chicken pecking at his sugar packets was just another Tuesday. Across the street, a gaggle of schoolkids chased a runaway rooster, giggling as it dodged them with the agility of a quarterback. Sam rubbed his temples. He knew he had to round up his flock before they caused more damage, or worse, became someone's dinner. He turned to Tom, who was already shaking his head. "I don't suppose you've got a plan for this?" the deputy asked. Sam exhaled, his breath fogging in the cool afternoon air. "Same plan I always use when things go sideways on the farm. Hard work, a little patience, and probably a lot of cursing under my breath." Tom gave a tired nod before glancing at Lydia, who stood on her porch, arms crossed, looking far too smug for someone who'd just turned Willow Creek into a chicken apocalypse. "I don't see what the problem is," she called out, her voice carrying over the squawking. "This is what chickens were meant for, to be free. They're enjoying themselves." Sam turned slowly, his eye twitching. "Lydia, do you have any idea how much damage you've caused?" She huffed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Oh, please. They're just chickens. It's not like they're destroying the town." As if on cue, a loud crash echoed from the bakery down the street. Moments later, Mr. Larson, the baker, burst out the door, covered in flour and waving a rolling pin. Two hens scurried past him, beaks stuffed with stolen bread rolls. Sam gave Lydia a long, unimpressed stare. She cleared her throat and looked away. "Well, maybe a little damage." Sam turned back to Tom. "I need to get my birds back." "You need help?" Tom asked, eyeing the anarchy. Sam glanced around. "Oh yeah." Within minutes, Operation Chicken Roundup was underway. Sam enlisted his farmhand, Jimmy Tate, a lanky 20-something with more enthusiasm than coordination, along with a handful of townsfolk who either found the situation hilarious or just wanted their yards back. Armed with nets, feed buckets, and a grim determination, they spread out across Willow Creek. It should have been simple. It wasn't. Sam started with the hens closest to the farm. He crouched low, shaking a bucket of grain and using his best, "Trust me, I'm your farmer" voice. "Come on, girls, time to head home." The nearest hen stopped, tilted her head, and blinked at him. For a fleeting second, Sam thought it might work. Then she bolted. Like a switch had flipped, every chicken in sight went into full survival mode. Feathers exploded into the air as they scattered, darting in every direction. Jimmy Dove, for one, missed spectacularly and face-planted in the dirt. Sam groaned. "This is going to take all day." Down by the lake, a group of hens had gathered at the water's edge, pecking at their reflections. A few brave ones had waded in, floating like confused ducks. Sam approached cautiously, net in hand, and managed to scoop up one, only for a sharp squawk to pierce the air. His stomach dropped. A fox had emerged from the trees, its amber eyes glinting with predatory glee. Sam knew this was why the coop existed. If he didn't act fast, his flock would be a buffet. "Jimmy," he barked, letting out a sharp whistle. "Get over here now." Jimmy sprinted over, dragging Tom along. Sam flailed his arms, shouting at the fox to scare it off. The animal hesitated, sizing up the situation. 3 humans versus a smorgasbord of poultry. For a tense moment, it was a standoff straight out of a western. Then the fox lunged. Sam moved faster. He dove forward, startling the chickens into motion. Instead of freezing, they scattered, some into the water, some into his arms, a few straight into Jimmy, who yelped as he toppled backward. The fox, realizing its chance was gone, slunk back into the woods. Sam let out a shaky breath. That was too close. But the trouble was far from over. Back in town, Lydia stood by her house, filming the chaos like it was her personal reality show. She'd already posted snippets online, narrating how she'd saved the chickens. What she didn't expect was the chickens' next move. A few of the rowdiest hens had invaded her pristine backyard. One hopped onto her patio table and stomped through her kale salad, sending leaves flying. Another pecked at her glass of artisanal lemonade, tipping it over. Lydia let out a strangled cry. "Hey, no. Shoo. You're supposed to be free in the wild, not ruining my lunch." The chickens ignored her. Brutus, the biggest rooster of the bunch, strutted onto her porch and flapped his wings. Lydia took a nervous step back. "Now, listen here, chicken," she started, as if reasoning with him might work. Brutus responded with a deafening crow right in her face. She shrieked, flailing as she tried to escape, but in her panic, she stepped on a bread roll one of the hens had dropped earlier. Her foot slipped, her arms pinwheeled, and she toppled backward, straight into her decorative koi pond. The town watched as Lydia sat there, soaked, surrounded by floating lily pads and 3 unimpressed hens staring at her from the edge. For the first time all day, Sam allowed himself a smirk. Jimmy, still covered in dirt, ambled up beside him. "Think she's learned her lesson yet?" Sam watched as Lydia blinked at the sky, dripping wet and dazed. "Nah," he said, "but she's getting there." Lydia sat in the pond, her designer jeans ruined, her hair plastered to her face like wet seaweed. Brutus perched on the edge, letting out another triumphant crow as if he'd personally orchestrated her downfall. Townsfolk gathered, some stifling laughter, others openly grinning at the sight of Lydia finally facing the consequences of her liberation. Deputy Tom cleared his throat, trying to maintain a shred of professionalism, but even he couldn't hide the smirk tugging at his lips. Sam crossed his arms, letting the silence hang heavy before he spoke. "Well, Lydia, I hope this little stunt was worth it." She sputtered, shoving wet hair from her eyes. "Worth it? Worth it? These chickens ruined my backyard, destroyed my food, and I've been attacked by a wild animal." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Wild animal? That's just a rooster, ma'am." Lydia glared at Brutus, who fluffed his feathers as if daring her to keep talking. She turned back to Sam, her frustration boiling over. "You need to take responsibility for this. These are your chickens. This is your fault." Sam's patience, already worn thin, snapped like a brittle twig. He stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "No, Lydia, this is your fault. You ignored my warnings, trespassed on my land, and let my chickens loose like you were some kind of hero. And now look at the mess you've made." She opened her mouth to argue, but Tom cut in. "He's right, Lydia. You've caused damages, not just to Sam, but to half the town." He flipped open a notepad, scanning his scribbled list. "Let's see, destroyed flower beds, grocery store chaos, bakery losses, a wedding cake disaster, and trespassing on private property. That's a whole heap of trouble." Lydia's face paled. "You're not saying I have to pay for all that, are you?" Tom gave her a look. "You think this cleans itself up for free?" She let out a high-pitched huff, crossing her arms. "This is ridiculous. I was trying to help." Sam shook his head. "You weren't helping anyone. All you did was cause chaos, and now you're going to fix it." "Fix it?" she squeaked. Tom nodded. "That's right. Pressing charges would tie you up in court for months, so we figured community service might be a better fit." He turned to Sam. "And I believe Farmer Sam here has just the thing." Sam grinned, his first real smile of the day. "You're going to work on my farm, Lydia. 1 month, sunup to sundown. Feeding the animals, cleaning the coops, doing the real work that keeps those chickens happy and safe. And you're going to do it right, not whatever nonsense you think you know about farming." Lydia recoiled like he'd asked her to wrestle a bear. "Me? On a farm? For a month?" Sam nodded. "Unless you'd rather deal with fines and a town full of angry neighbors." She looked around, realizing she was outnumbered. Every pair of eyes carried the same message. "You made this mess. Clean it up." With no escape, she gritted her teeth and muttered, "Fine." The next morning, Lydia's city slicker life ended with a thud. She stood in Sam's yard, dressed in borrowed farm clothes, overalls 2 sizes too big, and a flannel shirt that clashed with her usual aesthetic. Her oversized boots clomped with every step, and her arms were crossed in a sulky pout. Sam handed her a bucket of feed. "First job simple, feed the chickens." She sniffed. "I think I can handle that." She marched into the coop, tossing handfuls of grain onto the ground like she was scattering confetti. Instantly, the chickens swarmed her, pecking and flapping. One bold hen, Daisy, hopped onto her shoulder, making Lydia shriek and spin in circles. Sam leaned against the fence, watching with amusement. "Gotta be careful, they ain't scared of you." "They're attacking me," she wailed, flailing until Daisy fluttered off. "Nah," Sam chuckled. "They just know when someone doesn't belong." For the next few days, Lydia learned the hard way that farming wasn't about posing with cute animals. She woke before dawn, dragging herself to the coop with bags under her eyes, shoveling out old bedding and laying fresh straw. She scrubbed water troughs, gathered eggs, and chased hens that seemed to delight in outrunning her. The worst part was Brutus. From day one, he'd made it his mission to torment her. Every morning, as she entered the coop, he'd puff up his chest, crow like a foghorn, and charge at her feet. Lydia spent more time dodging him than working, yelping as he nipped at her boots. By the end of the first week, she was a wreck, covered in dirt, sweat, and feathers, slumped against the barn wall in defeat. Sam ambled over, sipping his coffee. "Tired?" She groaned. "I don't get how you do this every day." "It's called hard work," he said with a smirk. Lydia shook her head. "I thought I was doing the right thing." I really believe they needed to be free. Sam sat on a hay bale, his tone softening. Lots of folks think they know what's best without understanding the whole picture. Chickens like to roam, sure, but they need protection. The coop ain't a jail, it's a home. She fell silent, staring at the horizon. She hated admitting it, but she was starting to see his point. The chickens she'd freed had nearly been eaten, had no clue how to survive, and had been panicked the whole time. Maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong. The month crawled by, each day a trial for Lydia. She shoveled manure until her arms ached, hauled water buckets until her shoulders burned, and learned to dodge Brutus's ambushes with surprising agility. The townsfolk watched her progress, some with pity, others with glee, but Sam kept her on task, his gruff demeanor hiding a flicker of respect as she stuck it out. One morning, as she scattered feed with newfound precision, Daisy hopped onto her shoulder again. This time, Lydia didn't flail. She froze, then slowly reached up and patted the hen's head. Daisy clucked and hopped off, leaving Lydia blinking in surprise. Sam, watching from the fence, tipped his cap. See? They're starting to trust you. Lydia wiped sweat from her brow. I didn't think they'd ever stop hating me. They don't hate you, Sam said. They just didn't know you. Takes time to earn their respect, same as people. By the final week, Lydia had changed. Her posture was less stiff, her complaints fewer. She still grumbled about the rooster, but she'd learned to sidestep his charges with a muttered, "Not today, buddy." The chickens, too, seemed calmer around her, pecking contentedly as she worked. On her last day, she stood before Sam, handing back the borrowed clothes. She looked different, less polished, more grounded. Brutus eyed her from the coop, his usual glare softened to mild disdain. Sam took the clothes, nodding. Well, I gotta say, you did better than I thought. Lydia crossed her arms. Does that mean I'm free to go? He smirked. You were always free, Lydia. You just had to put in the work. She glanced at the chickens, safe and happy in their coop. Maybe the coop isn't so bad after all. Sam chuckled. That's about as close to an apology as I'll get, huh? She huffed, but didn't argue. As she turned to leave, a loud flapping made her freeze. She spun around. Daisy had perched on her SUV's roof, staring at her with unblinking judgment. Before Lydia could react, the hen let out a piercing squawk. Lydia yelped and bolted, sprinting down the road as Sam's laughter echoed behind her. See you around, Lydia. She didn't answer. She was already gone. Weeks later, Willow Creek settled back into its quiet rhythm. Sam's chickens returned to their routine, the town repaired its damages, and Lydia's social media went silent on the chicken front. She still lived in her pristine house, but folks noticed she avoided Sam's farm and roosters altogether. One morning, as Sam sipped his coffee on the porch, Jimmy ambled up. Think she'll try liberating anything else? Sam watched the sunrise, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Nah, she's learned her lesson, at least till the next big idea hits her. In the coop, Brutus crowed, loud and proud, as if agreeing. Sam raised his mug in a silent toast. Some things, he figured, were best left as they were.